So they are going to present their duo project for us today. They're going to play. They're going to talk a little bit about the instruments, but since you're all wind players, you have a pretty good idea of how wind instruments function and percussion instruments. So I think I will just turn it over to these guys right now, Ravi Padmanabha and Steve Baczkowski.
Good afternoon. So yeah, as John was saying, Ravi and I are both musicians. We've been playing together for over 20 years. And we play in a lot of different contexts. We've played in a lot of ensembles over the years. But we've always maintained a duo of percussion and wind. And we've always played only free improvised music. Although we both do play composed music, and we've played, like I said, in lots of different projects. With this duo, we've always explored free improvisation. And in both of our individual efforts, we've strived to discover different sound sources and sound palettes and ways to combine sounds that aren't necessarily the most obvious ways of a cool groove and a hit melody or a fat bass line. Although we do occasionally venture into that territory, we've spent a lot of time working on textural elements and sound elements, and so I think we'll just we'll play a little bit. My primary instrument is the baritone saxophone, but I play all the saxophones and some clarinets and lots of different wind instruments. And as you can see, I'll show you some of the other things that help me develop my sound on the baritone. But yeah, the baritone has always been sort of my main voice, and I guess we'll just I'll play a little bit, and we'll see what happens. You can hear, yeah, that it's a very open kind of conversational type of context to play in. And we like playing this way because it's very
Expressive.
it's expressive, and it's exciting because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know whether or not it's going to work. Some things work very well, other things not so well. But that's part of,
The exploration.
yeah, and you know, I always like to say to people, you know, if you have a really good conversation with someone, it's, you know, you get engaged and you're exchanging ideas back and forth, and it builds a momentum, and you have an exchange of ideas. You couldn't have the same conversation if it was entirely scripted and you were reading a conversation to each other. Nobody would want to listen to that, and nobody would want to engage in a conversation like that. So it's similar in that sense, because, you know, sometimes you have a conversation with someone and it's a nice conversation. You talk about the weather or how you've been doing. Other times you have a really deeply engaging conversation where you both come away having learned something and grown in some aspect. And so we like to play improvised music for that very reason. It's just much more engaging and enjoyable, and it brings the audience to the music in a different way. Now, I love playing through composed music, of course, and there's a lot of possibilities that come with planning and arranging and orchestrating different ideas. You can arrive at things that you wouldn't arrive at spontaneously. But it's more exciting, to really stick your neck out and take the risk. Maybe I will play something that doesn't work, or maybe I won't. I'll reach for an idea and it won't land, or Ravi will start doing something that I don't expect, and I wanted him to do this, but he didn't. And that it's nice to expose yourself to that kind of situation because it makes you vulnerable, which we all are. And you have to be very honest, and you have to, you kind of put yourself, you kind of lay it bare. There's no composition. They're like, well, so-and-so wrote that. If you didn't like it, it's the composer's fault. It's not my fault, You don't really have that option in improvised music, and that's what we find so enjoyable about it. So as you can tell, we like to explore a lot of textural components of sound and find different ways of combining sound that aren't necessarily about, the more traditional ways that we're used to putting music together. In my process of learning to play the saxophone, I wanted to explore the ancestry of this instrument and, how we arrived at this very complicated piece of equipment. As you all know, everybody here is brass or wind?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or percussion.
Or percussion, right. So, I was really interested in sort of undoing a lot of the things that I learned with this instrument. The system of the saxophone is designed, as are most Western wind instruments, to place notes together in sequence, mostly to form melodies. And there's not a lot of time and attention placed on the complexity of a single note or a single sound. So I started to just explore other ways to make music, and as I went further and further back, I was able to discover aspects of playing wind instruments that were sort of lost in the modern Western world. Things like this had to happen before this happened. And before people had the technology to develop something as sophisticated as this, they had to use the materials that were there, in their environment. And as you all know, this is an animal horn, particularly a buffalo horn. And this is, could be used for a lot of different things. It used to carry different items and things like that. But when you, cut the end off and put a hole in it, and you vibrate the air inside somehow, you can make a sound. So immediately with the addition of a human intention and creativity, what was formerly, a buffalo horn or something to carry some liquid in or something like that becomes a musical instrument. And so this is a buffalo horn that I got from Buffalo, but a friend of mine from Senegal carved it for me, and he carved it in the fashion that they use it in Senegal. So rather than play it like this, like you might see a shofar played, this is the mouthpiece, and your thumb goes over the end here, and your hand goes here, and it produces. So you can hear that with just, your thumb and your hand and your lips, you can get quite a variety of sound out of this. And these were, of course, not just used as entertainment or, for music. They were used in all kinds of ceremonial and ritual applications, and they had quite a significance in the context that they were used, and was not treated lightly. I mean, this could call people to war. This could be used in hunting. It could be used in all sorts of different manners, and as a communication tool to communicate across distances beyond what the voice would allow. And so, of course, as you could well imagine, you know, somebody put another hole here and another hole here, and, you know, after a while, you end up, you know, with something like this, or, of course, the trumpet, trombones, and tubas, the whole brass family. You know, to this day, we call these instruments horns because they came from horns. And I remember the day that dawned on me. It was like, I've been playing music half my life, and it never occurred to me that we call these horns because they used to be horns. And even, you know, you honk your horn on the car. You know, it doesn't make sense to honk a horn unless it has this application. And so it goes very deep. And so, of course, people that had buffalo or animals with horns around them, once they, you know, find the carcass and they use everything that they can from it, eventually somebody figured out that these things could make sound. And it's the same with this instrument, which is a conch shell. And if you live on the ocean, you know, you would find these, of course, washed up on shore after the animal that lived in it ceased to need it. These were left behind, and I would imagine at some point, it had to happen one day, where a person picked up one of these, and, you know, they come to a point, typically at the end. So I imagine that somebody picked one up that had been smashed on a rock and the tip was knocked off, and they, you know, someone had the bright idea to put their lips up to it and buzz. And so you get, and it's a very strong sound, very powerful sound. And like the horn, you know, particularly in Haiti, but in many cultures, this instrument has strong cultural significance, and again, could be used to call to war. You could use it to communicate across distances, and they actually would develop a linguistic correlation. So you could actually say things like, "Come over here," you know, "I'm hurt," or, you know, we've just made a kill, or "come to the party," or whatever it may be. There are ways you could actually make specific communications with this instrument. So it wasn't just for fun and for entertainment. These instruments were used in all sorts of ceremonies, from birth, coming of age, matrimony, funeral rites, all kinds, every significant aspect of human life was somehow punctuated by these instruments. They were almost a necessary element. And this instrument, you know, just like with the horn, when you put your hand inside it, so you can manipulate the sound quite a bit, just like you do with a plunger or other mutes with brass instruments. So in exploring these instruments, it helped me to simplify the saxophone, because I sort of accumulated, as we all do, a lot of baggage associated with playing this instrument, and what it means to be a good musician, what it means to be a good instrumentalist. Like, I have to be able to technically play anything. I should be able to play jazz, and I should be able to play classical, and I should be able to play fast, and I should be able to do all these things in order to qualify as a good musician. And I realized that that was starting to get in the way of my ability to perform. And so in exploring these instruments and sort of stripping away the keys and the ideas of, you know, 12 keys and, you know, its relationship to the piano and the whole system that we have in the West through which we organize music, it was nice to sort of free myself from that and realize that I could make music with these deceptively simple devices. And again, you know, this is just a shell until a human being decides that it's an instrument. And so the application of your creativity is what transforms this object from one thing into another. The object doesn't change, but its use and its practice and its relationship does. So, and then in continuing with that, I had first heard a recording of this. Know what this instrument is? Yeah, it's a didgeridoo from Australia, played by the Aboriginal people of Australia for some, say, 100,000 years. It's most likely the first wind instrument, probably in the running with the other two I just shared with you. But this instrument is a tree. It's literally the trunk of a tree that had, branches growing out, and it had bark on it and leaves. And, and they're hollowed out by termites, because even today, to hollow out a piece of very heavy, dense wood like this, we don't even have drill bits that could hollow out something like this. So it's very much necessary that nature lends a hand. And in the particular areas where the didgeridoo is played, there are lots of termites, and they live in these massive nests that are 15 feet high, and they look like giant alien cities, and billions of termites live inside them. So when you go to where those nests are and you go to the trees in the area, you would take a stick and you would tap, and you'd be able to hear the termites have been here. And the termites, fortunately, they only like the sweetest part of the tree, the center, so they'll eat out the middle and they'll leave the rest. So much like, the mollusk or gastropod, whatever lives in these things, when it died, it left this behind. The termites go through the tree, kill the tree, but they leave this behind, and then a human being comes along and transforms it into a very useful tool. And so the Aboriginal people still play this instrument to this day, and they never really moved beyond, technologically, they never moved beyond the use of this instrument. And basically they use their voice, they use the didgeridoo and percussive elements, usually slapping your thigh or clicking two sticks together. And the music is extremely sophisticated and complex. And when you first listen to it, if you listen with Western ears, it might come off as primitive or simple sounding, and it's nothing of the sort. And it's so sophisticated that I couldn't even begin to attempt to replicate Australian Aboriginal music. And so I never endeavored to, because it would just sound like a bad imitation of the real thing. So when I started exploring all these different instruments, I never bothered to try to play the music from that culture, because I didn't want to be just like a bad version of the real thing. And so I have always embraced the idea of 21st century indigenous Buffalo, New York music. And that's what I play. And so I play the way a guy from Buffalo would play, whatever that means. But that was, for me, a more natural way to pursue understanding these instruments and sort of gathering what they have to offer. So this instrument, like I said, they'd find the hollow tree, you cut it, strip the branches off, strip the bark off. This one is actually from Australia, is from a particular tribe in Australia made by someone who's been part of many, many generations of didgeridoo makers. They don't call it a didgeridoo in Australia. Didgeridoo is an onomatopoeic term that the British applied when they went and they heard the Aboriginal people, and they heard didgeridoo, 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 and so they started calling it a didgeridoo, and that's become the globally accepted name for the instrument, but it actually has a different name depending on where you go in Australia. Yidaki is one of the main terms they use in Australia. So this is a yidaki, and like I said, it was made in Australia, and the patterns that are on it would immediately let you know who made it and what tribe it's from. It's a very distinct pattern and design. This one I love because it's very simple. A lot of times they're adorned with different animals, totemic images of different animals, and with really sophisticated design work. But this one I really love because of its simplicity. So I'll play this a little bit so you can get an idea of what it sounds like. So you get an idea, the wood is very dense and the termite tracks run all down the inside. So it's very textured internally. There's like labyrinthine pathways that wind all the way down the inside of it. And so it has this dense kind of punchy sound. And the more you play it, the more subtlety comes out of it. And like I was saying before, you listen to the Aboriginal recordings of it, you can't figure out what the hell is going on. I mean, the way the cycles move, there's no idea of one. There's no concept of counting, we all come back in at this point or something like that. It's much more of an organic thing, and the music has evolved from generation to generation over many, 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 many thousands of years. So the only way to replicate that music is to live in that culture and to be born and raised in it. Yeah?
So there's a story I read. Some American musicologist was fascinated with this music and in the 50s went to study it.
Mm-hmm.
And the impression among Western musicians was, as you're saying, it all sounds the same.
Yeah.
He went, he studied, he brought the Aboriginal guru back with him, took him to a concert of a Beethoven Fifth Symphony at the Chicago Symphony. And about 10 minutes through the piece, the Aboriginal master said to the musicologist, "Why do they keep playing the same thing over and over?" So our ears
exactly.
like we were talking yesterday, where the synapses are formed, right?
Yes.
The roots are formed, we're sort of pre-programmed, like it or not. Sorry.
And oh no, that's great. And yeah, that's why, you know, when I listen to it, the more you get into it, the more you realize just how sophisticated and complex it is. And, you know, like with these other instruments, this is not an entertainment device. This is a very serious, very sacred instrument, and it's regarded very highly. There are stories in different tribes that credit the didgeridoo with the creation of the universe. There's a lovely story about the first man who was alone in the outback by himself in the desert, and he was naked and he was cold, and so he gathered up wood to start a fire. And as he was feeding branches into the fire, he noticed that there were termites living inside one of the branches. And so, not wanting to burn them alive, but still wanting to use the wood, he put his mouth up to the end of it and he blew into it to get the termites out, and it produced the sound of the didgeridoo, and the sound carried the termites out of the end of the branch, and they became the stars and the planets. So it's taken very seriously, and when I was researching the instrument, when I was first learning it, of the true power of what music is, because we live in a society where music is reproducible by machines, and you know, you can replace musicians with recordings of musicians. And nowadays, people sort of equate the two as being the same thing. You know, I always, whenever I'm in front of young children, I always say, music does not come from speakers, it comes from people. It only comes from people. If you're hearing music through speakers, you're hearing a recording of music, you're not hearing music. And that's because music is an active thing that happens in real time as a direct correspondence. I feel that I could be more honest as a musician. I found that improvised music allowed for that, where I wasn't doing my best impression of you know, a great saxophonist whose recordings I've listened to. I just being myself. And when you're vulnerable as a musician and when you're honest, that allows for a relationship with the audience that I think is much more deeper than, again, playing something that maybe you worked out in advance. You're sort of laying yourself bare in front of the audience. So eventually, you know, all of this is just to say that, you know, in the end, I came to realize that the saxophone and the shells and the didgeridoo are all the same thing. They're all the same instrument. They're just a medium to send vibration through, and then you manipulate the sound waves by either opening and closing the holes, essentially lengthening and shortening the tube, and you know, changing the sound with your embouchure or manipulating it physically with your hand. You know, I spent a lot of time working with this, but eventually I wanted something that had a bit of a more versatile application. So I made this many years ago, and this is just 2 pieces of PVC that I got at the hardware store. You know, this is plumbing pipe, this is kind of an electrical pipe, and they fit together pretty well. I actually got really lucky. There's a slide position, and then there's a locking position, just from the slight irregularity of the shapes. And so this just allowed me, as you would expect, to change the pitch. So you can hear, obviously, this is not a traditional Australian didgeridoo. It has a very different sound. It's a perfect smooth cylinder down the inside, so it has a kind of a brighter tone. And I can slide, and also you can hear I could do the more trombone-like overtones by tightening up my embouchure. And so again, there's no buttons to push, so I was able to shed having to think about what key am I in, am I, hitting the right notes, that kind of thing. It was nice to be able to shed that and still make music. It's like, just blow into the tube, you can make music with just that. And it made me realize the malleability of a single tone. There's so much sound inside a single note. And we're so used to moving from one note to the next that sometimes we don't notice. And the vibrations gain power over time. As you continue to play, it continues to have its effects. So what was really beautiful about this is I learned to really feel what each vibration felt like physically. And even though you don't have any keys, it's still quite sophisticated. By changing the shape of my oral cavity, I can run through the harmonic overtone sequence. So the same way that we shape our vowels when we speak, A, E, I, O, U. And that's just, a single pitch. And then you can add your voice. And so now you've got two vibrations going down the tube at once. See, there I was singing just slightly flat from the pitch that I'm producing with the didgeridoo, and you hear the two pitches sort of battling it out inside, which is a very powerful effect, very tiny, tiny intervals, which we don't even use in Western music. They're using these extremely sophisticated micro intervals, even to get a rhythmic effect. I can So, in that sense, you actually can feel what a third feels like. You can feel what a minor third feels like. A fifth, boy, you feel a fifth. It goes straight from all the way up, and then an octave. It's like coming from your feet, from the earth. And you actually have a physical sensation of the intervals. And then, of course, you probably noticed I'm not stopping to breathe. And that's a very fundamental aspect of this instrument. And I mean, we're very much used to filling our lungs, playing as long as we can, and you stop playing and you fill your lungs again. So in a sense, we're always limited by our lung capacity in terms of phrase length or the length of a single vibration. And this, like today, by modern players, is considered an extended technique or some kind of, and it's the most ancient of wind techniques. It's been around forever. But yeah, it allows you to play on for as long as you like, and I've gone for over an hour without stopping to actually take a breath and continually making sound. Talk about changing your state of mind. You keep a single vibration going for over an hour, and you'll find you're in a very different state than when you started, when it's over. So, these were all ways, I mean, and I don't mean to disrespect our Western music culture. I love it. I mean, this 12-tone system has yielded an insane amount of possibilities, and it's wonderful, but it's sort of at the expense of some sort of really basic quite magical and mystical aspects of music. And so by exploring these instruments, it enabled me to see the saxophone as just the same thing. Instead of having all this sort of psychological baggage associated with what I needed to do to be a good saxophonist, I was able to relate it with these other instruments. And just to sort of bring it full circle here, I can show you. Eventually, I arrived at this, which was actually my brother does some metal spinning on the side. He has a friend who has a lathe, and they would get orders from medical supply companies and things like that. And he said this was actually supposed to be for a colonoscopy tool. And it was a reject piece. It didn't come out right, so he thought Steve would like this, so he set it aside for me. And so I adapted it a little bit so that I could fit it on my baritone. And lo and behold, so they very much are the same thing. So that's all I'm going to do for now, because I'll go on forever. And
Let's play a ditch thing.
Okay, sure.
We got it out now.
We got about 10 minutes.
Are you serious? I'm sorry.
Ravi, can you give us like a concise guide to the tabla?
Like a 10-minute tabla for dummies.
How about like a 3-minute tabla for dummies?
Why didn't you stop me?
Crash course? Okay. Well,
You can't hold genius back.
I mean, it's a great talk. This guy. I bought my whole symphony. This is my orchestra right here. You know, I got, you might call it the kitchen sink, but every little piece has this little, that's the string section. This is soloist. That's the timpani. So, but I'm going to cut right to the soloist here. These are the tabla from India. And I got drums from everywhere. The Dumek is from the Middle East. This is the daff, the jingles, and the frame drum. But anyways, these are the tabla from India. Highly evolved drums. Initially, they were very big drums on elephants for war drums. As the centuries went on, it's been made smaller, and the techniques have been very refined. This is a metal shell, and this is a wooden shell that's hollowed out halfway. It's very heavy. And the heads are goatskin, and you can see there's multiple layers here, and there's this very specific black dot in the middle, which really gives the magical tone. It's iron filings, some charcoal, rice paste, and then, there's a lot of tension. You can see these straps on here. And just for one drum, it's the tones, these combinations of tones are just magical. And obviously this is very high pitch, and you can see the pegs and the straps. Well, this one is the bass drum, much lower. And you can better pitch on this thing with the pressure you put on your wrist here. So you put these two drums together, and I got to even say the name. They're called the tabla. Okay, and I mean basically they're the drums from North India, and they can play in a folk situation or in Indian classical music. And we have many percussionists here.
Two back here, got two down here.
Okay, you guys heard tabla? Okay, unfortunately they're kind of rare. I don't know why, but everyone knows a bongo and a conga and a drum set, or maybe a marimba or a timbale. These drums are really so deep and magical.
So when you learn a pattern, you have to be able to, it's sung to you, right?
It's spoken, yeah.
It's spoken. So now if you were going, could you speak a pattern and then play it for us?
It's oral tradition taught down from the master guru to a student. You don't get a book or paper. You sit in front of the guru one-on-one, and he tells you beat, and then you got to pick it up. So basically, it's a spoken language. Anything I play can be spoken. So all these strokes, you all have a name. Na, tete, tu, da, gay. But gay and na together, you get da. So an example would be like da tete da tete da da tete da gi then again ta tete da tete da da tete da gi then again. denegene tati dagi nanda tiri tati dagi denegene. Another one, gina tiri gina dagi denegene tiri gina tati tati gina tati dagi denegene gina tiri gina dagi denegene tiri gina tati tati dagi gina tati dagi denegene gina tiri gina dagi denegene tiri gina. My tongue does not work as good as my hands, so forgive me. My speaking was never my strong point. But so you get the kind of idea, you know. So it's a whole spoken language that you can transfer the knowledge of a specific composition. Just not, you know, it's just not like a groove. It's a whole piece of music by itself, just like a symphony. You know? So that's a little taste of the whole composition aspect of topic. We should play some. It's only 5 minutes. I guess we're going to play something now. spilled some beans.
Insights.
So when you guys were at UB, you played in ensembles, right?
Yeah,
What
jazz
did-
ensemble,
Jazz?
Yeah, I played in the jazz combos, the jazz ensemble.
percussion ensemble, hip-hop state,
And,
with maybe jazz.
and as a biology major,
Yeah.
music was, would you say, important to your
Pretty
curriculum?
essential for my soul and my GPA.
Right, yeah, because if you show up and you practice, you could get an A in band.
Boost up my organic chem. But essential.
No questions?
Do you perform anywhere, like, often?
Quite a lot, yeah. Yeah, lately we've been playing a trio with a bassist, just saxophone, bass, and drums, almost like a more traditional kind of jazz trio. Not, I mean, it's still very free,
Whip it up.
but we have a few tunes that, that we play.
So you play together?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
we've been playing
Decades.
together for over 20 years. And, we've played in many, many, many projects together, but we've always done the duo, and the duo has always been improvised.
How did you guys get the idea to do the duo? Well, how did that come about?
Everybody else would quit or leave,
Yeah,
or, it was just like,
Just you two of you were the last ones in the room?
yeah, it was just like,
We're a duo now.
and I remember when we first started playing, we had these little kind of tunes that we played,
Right, yeah.
and eventually we gave up on those.
Yeah.
Because it just started to feel silly.
Right.
Yeah, it was just a natural inclination, I think.
Winds and drums are just so good together.
Yeah, there's something ancient about the horn and drum combo that was just really easily accessible, and I could be unbound by harmonic concerns. I could just go wherever I felt like, and it was great. I didn't have to worry about playing
Missing
my
the changes.
2-5-1 patterns. There's plenty of other people that could deal with that. So yeah, and I would always say it's like I could spend a ton of time trying to play like John Coltrane, but I'll never be able to sound like John Coltrane because he's John Coltrane. But nobody can out Steve Baczkowski me. I have that shit down. Even on my worst day, I am the best at playing like Steve Baczkowski, which I feel okay saying. Because yeah, even when it sucks, I'm still just being honest and being myself rather than doing my best version of somebody else's music. So playing this music was just a way to sort of take ownership of it. But yeah, we do this duo a lot. We have
12-8 Path
we
Band.
actually have vinyl records of this duo and CDs, none of which we brought.
No,
No.
that's.
We just make them, we don't actually distribute them.
We would get a marketing director to tell us to bring this.
Right.
We can't figure that out.
But yeah, we both play in a lot of different groups. We play in like a street band, like a horns and drums kind of Afro-Caribbean street band
John's in it.
with John. John plays sousaphone and trumpet in that. I play in like an Afrobeat orchestra. I play in some other sort of more jazz-like groups, Buffalo Jazz Octet, and then I also collaborate with a lot of musicians from outside of Buffalo, and will occasionally go on tour and play in other cities and other countries, but mostly just playing improvised music.
Thank you very much, guys.
Gigs coming up?
What's that?
Any gigs coming up, like this weekend?
We did have a gig next Thursday, but it looks like it's not happening. There's a place called Duende. It's in Silo City downtown. It's a really cool
Very
space.
cool.
It's a whole bunch of abandoned grain elevators, and they turn the office building into a club. And we've been playing there at least once a month. And it's a really a special place. Any other questions before? Yeah.
Pretty sure my friends saw you guys play because I had a friend who I went to this gig and they played all this weird stuff and I was like, that sounds crazy.
about right.
And then he was telling me about Duende, so I'm like, oh, that must have been the same people.
Guilty.
Pretty cool though. He said it was awesome.
Cool. Excellent. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, it's a great space. Yeah, we've been playing there at least once a month, and we don't really have a name, it's just our last names. We've been Baczkowski Padmanabha duo for 20 years. It's like the two most unpronounceable, incompatible names.
It's great branding, our marketing office.
Baczkowski Padmanabha duo, so look for us.
Look us up online and you can spell our
And
name.
the trio is Baczkowski Padmanabha de Jesus. So, yeah, another bewildering element to throw into the name. And as John said, I curate the concert series at Hallwall's Contemporary Arts Center, which I've been doing for a long time now. And we bring musicians from all over the country and all over the world, mostly doing contemporary music and improvised music, avant-garde, or whatever, kind of music. So if you go to hallwalls.org, you'll see all the different things that we're doing. We're in a church on Delaware and West Upper, downtown. And it's a 45-year-old multidisciplinary nonprofit that has a rich history of making cool things happen about the world.
Thanks, guys. Awesome having you in. All right, band, I'll see you Monday. Practice over the weekend, please.
Work on your circular breathing.
He's inspired to practice.